How will we power our future? Can we create a healthy and clean economy? Climate One at the Commonwealth Club is at the forefront of the global debate about energy, economy, and the environment. Bringing together the brightest and most provocative leaders of our time, Climate One is the place where big ideas get heard. With thoughtful and insightful discussions on policy, business, science, and culture, Climate One founder Greg Dalton gets to the heart of the matter. It's our future. It's time to come together.
Can oil companies reinvent themselves as clean energy providers? John Browne attempted it more than a decade ago as CEO of British Petroleum, where he led the company's Beyond Petroleum rebranding campaign. In his book, Make, Think, Imagine, Engineering the Future of Civilization, Browne argues that the solution to reducing emissions is a mass deployment of engineered technology, and that the tools we need to get there already exist. In the second half of our show, are flying cars a realistic solution to congestion or just techno-fantasy? Companies are already testing prototypes, but there are human and legal barriers to this Jetsons future. Drones, however, are advancing battery technology that could curb the growing emissions of aviation. Gazing at the skies, today on Climate One. The central thesis of your book is engineering and innovation drive the human enterprise. You start with looking at fire and agriculture. So what is the central thesis about how engineering and innovation have sort of shaped human history?
Well, I've spent half my life really looking at different forms of artistic culture, performance art, a whole variety of things like that, literature. And I speak to people who say, this is the basis of civilization. And I always worried about this statement because I think without something to build on, it's very difficult to see how you could build great art, how you could build great buildings, how you could create great plays. And the foundation of all that is the foundation of engineering, starting with the hand axe, which allowed humans to change their diet and therefore develop very significantly, right through to some wondrous piece of equipment today, the James Webb Space Telescope, which is going to be launched next year, and it's going to go to a place called the Second Lagrangian Point, which is 1 million miles away from Earth, and it's going to sit there, and when it's unfolded, it unfolds like a great big umbrella. It's going to look further in the distance than we've ever seen before, which means we're going to see closer to the beginning of time. And I think those two things, to my mind, bookend the engineering platform upon which all civilization is built. And I thought that people didn't really give it credit. They looked at the downside, not the upside. Everything that engineering does has two faces, and I wanted to discuss that. And I wanted to redefine engineering as well as the piece that sits between the amazing fruits of discovery, the laboratory, if you will, and humanity and the commerce and the market on the other end. And in between, there's this Janus-faced thing called engineering, looking both ways. And in between, it makes these amazing transformations. And I wanted to talk about those.
And you write about how technology should be a servant, not a master. Mm-hmm. How do we make sure that we're not servants of the technology?
Well, because I think in the end, we do invent it, and we never really let it get out of hand. We almost did from time to time.
You've seen 2001: Space Odyssey?
Oh, yes. But that, I think, was a very good way of telling people what they should do to stop it getting out of hand. And the reason we allow it not to get out of hand is, first, we are humans, so we don't normally let ourselves be destroyed. And secondly, we are ingenious, so we can, the hallmark of the human is imagination and ingenuity. And therefore we invent things that counteract the bad side of engineering.
Do you think there will be stranded assets that, some people would say that if we burn all the carbon that's on the balance sheet of the oil companies today, civilization will go way past 2, 3, 4 degrees. So the oil companies' balance sheets are in conflict with civilization.
Well, I think we need to be very careful about oil companies for a moment. I'm
Including
agreeing
the state oil companies.
That's the point.
Yeah.
So the companies that we see today and everyone talks about probably produce between 15 and 20% of the world's oil, these great big companies. Who really produces the oil are all the state companies, and there's a lot of them. And that's where
China, Saudi Arabia,
remember
Russia.
that the balance sheet is everybody. Now, I really do firmly believe we will still need hydrocarbons for a very long time, oil and gas in particular, and probably the demand for oil and gas in 20 years' time will be similar to today. It'll be a smaller portion of the energy system. So some of it will be produced. It cannot be produced without decarbonizing it. We have to be able to take out the carbon post-combustion or take out the carbon pre-combustion by converting, for example, gas to hydrogen and carbon dioxide, which is easy to do. It's just expensive. So I think it is impossible, I think, to replace all of this with the right number of calories from other sources. And so I think we have a brick of this. Who produces it? It all depends. It could all be produced by the state companies with the big companies leaving the scene. That's very possible. I think that would be undesirable because there are no people you could control directly and no people you could push to actually do something different in this industry and potentially become a role model.
John Hofmeister is former president of Shell Oil. We asked him to assess John Browne's legacy and specifically BP's 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil debacle in the Gulf of Mexico.
I'm glad to know that John Browne is speaking at Climate One. He has great perspectives on the future, and he was instrumental in the industry's movement towards the energy transition during his tenure of leadership, in which he started transitioning BP into other alternative forms of energy such as solar, wind, and so on. Now, on the downside, under John Browne's leadership, the name BP became known in the industry in a rather vulgar sense as best price, where the concentration by John Browne and his executives on cost came to front the future with how negotiations took place on costs, investments, safety procedures, and so on. And BP ran through a litany of incidences, all of which had to do with not spending the money that needed to be spent to do things in proper form. The disaster of the Deepwater Horizon drilling ship and the BP-owned Macondo well never had to happen. This was a man-made incident that was rushed because it was costing a lot of money to keep the rig out there, and it was way over budget, and the pressure was unrelenting. There are environmental implications for every single form of energy that's out there. But my starting premise is the world of the 21st century needs more, not less energy. Full stop. Even in the future, when all personal cars are electrified, there will still be uses of oil and natural gas because that's such an available, reliable, affordable form of energy.
That was John Hofmeister, former Shell Oil president and founder and CEO of Citizens for Affordable Energy. John Browne, your reaction to those words from a former fellow oil man?
So, first of all, the facts speak to themselves. BP had some very bad incidents in my watch.
Texas City and
not the Deepwater. I'd gone almost 4 years before that.
But people would say the cost cutting that you drove set in motion some of the things that
they can say whatever they want, and I'm not prepared to disagree or agree with them. what I would say is the one that happened in my watch, which is Texas City, the explosion, I will never forget. It was a human tragedy above everything else.
15 people killed.
15 people killed. I was there when the last body was recovered. I did not flinch at saying we were fully accountable for it. We therefore solved as much as we could with money very quickly, and we learned a lot of lessons, which I had firmly believed we began to apply. I don't think it's all about cost cutting. I think it's about the mentality and the culture to make sure that we really thought about what we were doing as part of a big system, not just the safety of individuals, but the safety of individuals with machines and machines by themselves. So it's more than just cost cutting. I think that is an easy thing to say, and I don't think it fully came out, certainly not in the Texas City incident, as the result of it. But my view of these things is they are what they are, and they caused death and damage to humans, and therefore they were bad, and for whatever reason, they must not be repeated.
There's parallel stories I've seen between BP, VW, and some others where companies try to get into the top tier. You took BP with sort of a second tier, aggressive mergers, grew it dramatically, and that growth and scale creates some problems. VW was kind of a second tier automaker. They wanted to be number one, and they became number one, and the cost was Dieselgate and deception. And so there's, is that fair to say that sometimes these companies lose sight of their values as they try to get to the top and grow at all costs?
I think what maybe, I don't think you can cut it one way or the other definitively. I think there's much more complexity in the reasons. But I do think that one thing that happens is when you build cultures from different groups of people, you have to be very clear that you're attending to everything in the same way across the whole organization, and things don't fall out between the cracks. For example, in Texas City, it was not only the fact that we had people who not everyone knew how to deal with the pieces of equipment needed to be handled. This is the particular incident that happened. And secondly, they were using a particular piece of equipment that should have been replaced anyway. So the combination of these two things coming together created an appalling tragedy,
Should carbon goals be included in the compensation structures of oil executives?
Oh yes, there's no doubt that if you've got a target that you think is very important, it should be included. There has to be a text around it to explain, how you're going to get there, not just do it, because they may get the wrong answer.
And Shell, I think, has done that among, I don't know if any others have done that. Arctic drilling, you've been it's back in the news these days, drilling in the Arctic. Shell walked away from about $7 billion going into the Arctic. You were critical of that venture. Are there some places that we should not drill for oil, that should be off limits?
Yes, there's no doubt. The ones where their risk reward is not good enough, I think, is very simply that. The risk to the environment, far too high, because you can't recover from making a mistake or something going wrong. The Arctic is one of those areas. BP had one issue there. So as you know, if you have a well on production and it's covered with snow and ice which is thick enough, it could leak, and you may not know that until the snow and ice melts. Nowadays you probably can. You can know about it, but you probably can't get at it. So you have to think about different ways of doing it. And why would you therefore get into the very risky business of drilling in those places? I think standards change, our understanding of what we should do changes, and actually the way in which the industry is working. When the price of oil went up very high in the late 2000s, people decided that if they found oil wherever it was, it would be good. So they drilled all over the world. And actually a lot of those places, that oil is unnecessary. It will not be produced. It's too expensive or too hazardous to develop, and it shouldn't have been done. But with a lot of money, decisions get made in the wrong way.
Would you include the Canadian tar sands in that?
Very much so. I was very much against developing. I spent the late 70s in Canada as the head of BP's tar sands, oil sands task force. And I recommended that we stopped doing the business then.
Blade Runner, Star Wars, and the Jetsons envisioned futuristic worlds of flying cars and mile-high commutes. Now, dozens of companies are experimenting with airborne vehicles, including Airbus's electric flying car and Uber's helicopter taxi. Tesla has hinted at a flying roadster using rocket technology. Our guests today are Joby Aviation founder and CEO JoBen Bevert, attorney Jennifer Richter, former VOOM CEO Uma Subramanian, and analyst Charlie Vogelheim. What's the future of personal flight in the changing climate? So JoBen, let's begin with you. What's your vision for daily mobility and what this is going to be like? People, just paint the picture. Where are we going?
Yeah, this is it's a magical moment and really enabled by electric propulsion. It allows us to fundamentally rethink the architecture of an aircraft and allows us to create aircraft that are really massively superior to any aircraft that's been built before on a range of different dimensions. So the first of those is the safety. We can architect these aircraft, small aircraft, with redundant systems that provide incredible levels of safety. Second, acoustics, allowing these aircraft to land very proximately to where you want to depart from and where you want to go to. So we envision being able to take off and land from rooftops. And then finally, the economics. Right now, commercial air transport is incredibly cost-effective mode of transport for long distances, but it's very expensive for short-distance travel, and so we don't use it on a daily basis. We're stuck to surface transportation. And so if we can envision a future where we're flying every day to where we want to go, it allows us to really profoundly rethink society and the cities, the layout of our cities, allows us to rethink real estate. So it's a really exciting future that really moves transportation and daily mobility into the next century.
We'll drill into some of those things later. But Uma Subramanian, tell us where this is happening and how far in the future is this?
Yeah, so for me, the reason electric propulsion and urban air mobility are so interesting is studies show that by 2030, 5 billion people will live in the world's cities, so 60% of the world's population, up from about 45% of the world's population today, which is a material jump. So the next decade is forecast to be the greatest period of urban migration in human history. And if you look at what's happening in the biggest cities in the world, in Mexico City, in Sao Paulo, in Lagos, in the cities in China, ground infrastructure, as currently configured, can't keep up. So most of the carrying capacity is already accounted for. And so you've got two choices. You can take the sort of boring company approach and dig, which is very expensive on a per mile basis, or you can take to the sky. And so for me, what's really exciting is that we are at a point now where you can architect a city in a radically different way. And so the company that I ran, VOOM Flights, an Airbus subsidiary, recognized that electric VTOL technology, electric vertical takeoff and landing technology, in the spirit of not using too many acronyms, is coming, and it's on the horizon. And at Airbus, we were working on a number of different projects to try and build next-generation electric VTOL aircraft. But in the short term, you have a technology which is underutilized today, which are helicopters. And so the business that I ran was about using helicopters today as a precursor for electric VTOL technology to enable people to move in cities through the sky. And so the regulatory environment outside the US is pretty favorable for a number of reasons that are perhaps not politically correct, but you can test a number of different technologies and technical solutions in those markets. So Sao Paulo is the ideal city. So we launched in Sao Paulo in 2017. Sao Paulo has 700 helicopters and 400 rooftop helipads. And we were able to fly up to dozens of passengers a day in the city and really explore how you can unlock the urban sky with this technology.
So Jennifer Richter in Washington, D.C., what is the regulatory environment and what are the FAA and FCC doing? What are their roles looking at these things?
Wow. We just recently achieved the first authority from the FAA to allow Google to do package delivery. And so this is UAS, unmanned aircraft systems, lower to the ground, drones that are not carrying people, but packages. That took a lot to get done. They filed for 70 plus waivers of the current manned aviation rules in order to get that authority from the FAA, and that's only allowing them to deliver packages within the visual line of sight. So it's pretty limited still. The regulators are struggling mightily to figure out how do we enable all these great technologies in the systems that we have, and it's going to take some time to get done. For sure. And that's just UAS, again, package delivery. That's not putting people on drones. The different roles of the government agencies is interesting. So the FAA really looks at all of this from a safety perspective. The FCC has a role because you have to be able to communicate with these unmanned vehicles that are flying in the air. And so the FCC looks at this from a technology coexistence point of view. The wireless networks will be used to help support the communications functions of UAS and UAM. And that's
minus what UAS and UAM
Yep,
stand.
Unmanned aircraft systems, so drones, and urban air mobility, automated air taxis carrying people. The FCC is looking at how do we allow the wireless networks to be used in the air and on the ground simultaneously, and is there any technology coexistence that we need to figure out? Is there any interference that might occur?
There's a lot of sociology I've learned at a four-way stop in terms of cues. Is that person
waiting?
What does that nod mean? Are you going? Are you stopping? Right? Are you going to hit me? Am I going to hit you? Right? There's a lot of sociology at a four-way stop. Jobin, is it true that there's less of that in the air, or is it harder?
Absolutely, I completely agree with Uma that the autonomy for these sorts of aircraft is a simpler technological challenge than for ground vehicles. But there's something that's even more exciting, is that we don't need these to be autonomous in order for them to be profoundly impactful for all of our daily lives. So autonomy does allow us to reduce the operating cost of these aircraft, but whether that autonomy comes 5 years, 10 years, or 15 years from now, we're still going to be operating these aircraft within the next few years. So we're able to operate them just like a small airplane or a small helicopter is operated today, with a pilot within the existing air traffic control framework. And that's really exciting for the FAA and for the regulators, because that allows them to embrace this new technology, which is going to really fundamentally change daily mobility with the existing rules and the existing framework.
And we are finding that with collision avoidance technologies in particular, the technologies that have been invented for ground use to keep cars from colliding is often thought about for use in the air to assist with collision avoidance.
And is this a federal question at first? Is this going to be the federal government that's deciding this? It's not going to be Arizona deciding, there's been sort of this scramble with autonomous vehicles with Arizona. There's crash in California. Arizona says, come on, bring them over here. No problem, right?
Well, there isn't a state that hasn't tried to legislate with respect to unmanned aircraft. So the states really have gotten into the act. The FAA has tried to make clear that they have sovereignty over the airspace, but state and local governments can create their own rules around privacy and nuisance and those kinds of features that the community may be concerned about.
And I think generally in most countries, airspace is governed at the federal level. It's
Right,
very
okay.
rare that it's a kind of local jurisdiction.
Charlie Vogelheim?
Well, a good way to think of it, the FAA allows you to come into the air, and then it's the community that allows you to come back to the ground.
That's true.
So that's where the so it's a good thing to have. I'd like to just go back a little bit because you mentioned about the cars, and just remind everyone that we're at this crossroads where there's four things that are kind of a problem right now we have with transportation: congestion, pollution, mobility, just the ability to get into those that are getting older, and even safety. And this is what this autonomous vehicle development is trying to solve. But what we don't solve with what we call ACEs, which is the development of autonomous, connected, electrification, and shared vehicles, necessarily is the overall congestion issues. So then all of a sudden the idea is to take to the sky. And we can do that with this technology, and even if it is piloted and we have the sensors in there, the collision avoidance and things, it makes it either for an easier craft, a safer craft, or possibly less training required for the pilot.
Jobin, explain why electrification is key to this, because this is Climate One. We want to talk about displacing fossil fuels.
Yeah, so one of the big challenges with helicopters is they're incredibly noisy. And I don't want a takeoff and landing, a helipad sited on the building next door. And so in order for neighborhoods to ask for and embrace this, because as Charlie talked about, it's the airspace is regulated at the federal level, but the takeoff and landing locations are going to be regulated at the municipal level. And so whether it's a building owner who says, I want to have a takeoff and landing location here, their neighborhood is going to need to embrace this, right? They're going to need to say, yes, I want this. It's going to make our neighborhood, it's going to be like having a new subway stop in our neighborhood. So one of the beautiful things about electric propulsion is that the motor itself is drastically quieter. And so with a helicopter, your two noise sources are the rotor and the main rotor, the tail rotor, and then the engine, whether it's a turbine or piston engine. And the piston or turbine engine is about half the noise of the helicopter. So the electric propulsion solves half of that. It also massively reduces the emissions and massively increases the efficiency. So there's a whole bunch of ancillary gain from a climate perspective there.
Podcasts of this and other Climate One shows recorded with a live audience are available wherever you podcast. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time, everybody.